Speaker, I would like at the outset to give the assurance to the Chamber that I won't be too long in addressing this particular amendment. Part of what I expect will allow me to fulfill that commitment will be the fact that the economic matrix that gives the foundation for what we are about to do has been in large measure discussed in the just concluded debate on the what we call the BOSS bill, the Barbados Optional Savings Scheme bill. It certainly demonstrates, sir, that as we go about grappling with the issues, especially in this pandemic environment, we can't have tunnel vision. And therefore, a lot of the initiatives that we embark on will actually be cross-cutting and will, in some instances, be concerned with financing. And in other instances, sir, they'll be concerned with other aspects of government and how we deal with our people. In this case, and I don't know that we've ever had this, but we may have had it when we were preparing for Cricket World Cup. But today, sir, we have a rather unique experience of bringing to this chamber two pieces of sunset legislation in one day. The Barbados Optional Savings Scheme bill is a sunset piece of legislation, as is the amendments to the Severance Payment Act. And therefore, let me launch into this debate by pointing out that the amendments that we're going to make, that we are intending to make here today, are not amendments that are expected or that are planned to carry on into the future for any extended period of time. Sunset legislation, sir, is the nice name that we give to a piece of legislation which is only going to operate within a relatively narrow window of time. And we call it sunset because at a given point, the sun will set on its existence and it will cease to be much as the day as we know it would cease to be. So this piece of legislation is temporary in nature, and it is therefore not intended to affect the severance rights and obligations of the Barbadian worker beyond the limited period of time in which we find ourselves. Now, sir, I don't want to trespass too much on legal theory. But much of what we've been doing over the last 2.5, 3 months has been things focused on arresting the spread of COVID as an illness, as a disease. That is what has been keeping the Minister of Health, myself, Minister of Education, the Prime Minister, that's what's been keeping us awake most nights. How do we arrest the spread of the disease COVID-19? But at the same time, sir, we have been forced to come to grips with the fact that there are things that are the result of COVID-19 that we also have to grapple with. And that as successful as we are in relation to fighting the scourge, if we don't, with some alacrity, deal with the economic issues, the labor issues, the manpower issues, then, sir, we will have solved one set of the equation, but the other set of the equation will go a-begging. So while we've been focused every day on keeping our country safe as far as COVID is concerned, we are also equally obligated to keeping our country safe as far as its economic lifeblood is concerned. Now, Mr. Speaker, even before this administration took a decision to shut down the country, companies, enterprises, businesses in Barbados were all feeling the impact of a COVID critical world. They were feeling it because tourism numbers started to decline. In our early meetings, and I think the leader of the opposition would well remember that he was part of a consultation hosted by the Prime Minister, where the various political parties, the civic society, the church, every sector was represented. And there was a presentation by tourism, sir, and that was even before we thought about shutting down. And the hotelier said that already they were beginning to see large numbers of cancellations, and that they were at the point where they needed to respond to those cancellations. Businesses that had had orders, non-tourism related businesses that had had orders put in from overseas, found that those orders could not be fulfilled because the manufacturing entities in China that would have made and shipped them were shut down because of COVID. And that was in the early stages, sir. And our businesses in Barbados began to respond. How did they respond? For the most part, Mr. Speaker, they tried to encourage staff members to take vacation. You know, sir, one of the first things that you do in any enterprise, if you see that your economic activity is drying up, you start to think about cutting costs. How can I cut costs? How can I preserve my business? How can I go into a mode which is almost a state of dormancy, but still of a kind that will allow me to emerge at the other side as a fit and viable enterprise? And so, sir, even before our first COVID directive took hold on the 28th of March, Barbadian enterprises had begun to lay off workers. Many of them began by sending their workers on vacation. Others moved immediately to a layoff situation. Sir, by amending the Severance Payment Act as we propose today, it is that particular milieu that we'll be dealing with. Sir, under the existing legislation, an individual who is on layoff or short time for a period of 13 consecutive weeks has a right to serve on his employer a notice saying, "You have kept me on short time or layoff for the last 13 weeks. I don't know what my future is with you, and I am therefore opting to take severance payment. I am terminating my contract with you. I consider my employment with you to be at an end. I am taking severance payment. Pay me what you owe me under the Severance Payment Act." Now, sir, this has been happening from the time we had the Severance Payment Act. I think the current act was enacted in 1971. It is not an unusual occurrence. But what is unusual, sir, what is unusual, and what we're here to address, is that unhappy coincidence which finds large numbers of businesses all at the same time being exposed to the potential of large numbers of severance, of persons claiming severance at the same time. Now, I'm not going to project what the leader of the opposition will say. He'll probably say that we only looking out for big business. On the other hand, he may say nothing. Whatever he says, we will deal with. But the fact is that small businesses have laid off people, as have large enterprises. But in every instance, sir, the potential cost of a severance payment claim in an environment where economic activity is suppressed by, in some instances, as much or more than 100%, can have the potential of crippling those enterprises. So whether you are a cook shop in the middle of St. Joseph, a manufacturing concern in one of our manufacturing sectors, a hotel on the West Coast, or any kind of enterprise, doesn't matter. Severance payment claims can present a tremendous difficulty for a business in a situation where there is no economic activity, sir. And, I don't know that we are, at this point in time, articulating what economic activity is happening on a business-by-business basis. And perhaps that is a discussion that needs to happen. The Ministry of Finance has calculated that we will lose in revenue for the current year as much as $500 million. I think that's the correct figure. As much as $500 million. But that is government's revenue. What about the revenue, sir, of our manufacturers who have lost customers? What about the revenue of our merchants or people in the distributive sector who have also lost customers? What about the revenue of the services sectors, land surveyors? I understand from talking to land surveyors that the demand for land surveying services has virtually dried up. You know why, sir? It isn't that people don't need them. It is that in an uncertain economic environment, business dries up. And when business dries up, people who were thinking of making land investments put it on the back burner. People who were thinking of buying life insurance put it on the back burner. People who were thinking, sir, of borrowing a piece of money to do a renovation at a home, they put that on the back burner too. We could perhaps have done this as a conjoint debate, as a cognate debate with the Boss Bill, because the characteristics are so common. They're so common, sir. So when businesses are under threat, the notion of having to pay severance is one that becomes more than uncomfortable. Mr. Speaker, we have had businesses that have had to lay off in excess of 100, in some instances in excess of 200 people, all at the same time. What does that mean, sir? It means, sir, that under the existing legal regime, 13 weeks for all of those workers will fall all at the same time. And therefore, the right to claim severance will crystallize at the same time. And an employee in an uncertain economic environment under the law only has 4 weeks within which he must make his claim. He could wait 1 week, he could wait 2, he could wait 3. But by week 4, sir, if there's no indication that work is coming and that he has to open and he has the opportunity to come back to work, he will make his claim for severance payment. Sir, a moderate-sized restaurant, well, maybe a big restaurant in Barbados, but, they said in a meeting yesterday that if their employees all sought severance, that establishment severance payment bill would be $1.3 million. 1.6, $1.6 million. She said even if she wanted to, she couldn't, her cash flow would not support a loan to pay out those workers. Now, sir, as an administration, we have a responsibility for safeguarding the interests of all of Barbados with a minimum of friction and a minimum of waste. And this has nothing at all to do with the oft-touted claim that the Barbados Labour Party is the party of big business. Because the business that has a claim of that could face $1.6 million in severance is owned by somebody with the same skin pigment as me, somebody who is only half a generation away from poverty. Sir, if you thought about your law office and you had to work out the severance that you would have to pay your employees, I am sure, sir, that the figure would be a six-figure sum. And coming upon you at a time when business is diminished, you would have to figure out, well, how can I sustain that? There's another side to the equation, and I expect that it will be spoken about by one of the other speakers. But that has to do with what happens if the employer can't pay severance. He or she will have to send his employees to the severance payment fund. And the severance payment fund, as it always does, will pay. But the first question is, will pay when? Because there is such a backlog at the severance payment fund in terms of matters before the tribunal that dates back years, that by the time an employee is able to actually benefit from a claim to the fund, 4, 5, 6 years will pass. And even if there was an expedited process, the number of claims that would be made against the fund are potentially of such magnitude as could make the fund illiquid. So, as we look at the landscape, we've had to work out what can we do to help to preserve businesses, because businesses employ labor. What can we do to help to preserve the liquidity of the severance payment fund? What can we do to make sure that labor continues to see the benefits that they have subscribed for and worked on, on which basis they've worked for now 50 years? And all of those things have to be dealt with at one and the same time. So, what is our solution? Our solution, sir, is to so amend the Severance Payment Act as to extend the period of time after which your right to severance will crystallize from 13 weeks to 22 weeks. Now, some people say, well, why 22 weeks and not 26? Because, sir, you have 4 weeks within which you can serve a notice. So we extend it to 22 weeks, and you have another 4 weeks within which you can serve a notice, which takes you to 26. What's the magic number of 26, sir? At this point in time, a person will collect an unemployment benefit for 26 weeks. And after 26 weeks, the unemployment benefit stops. So all of these are the things that have had to go into this equation. So what we're saying, sir, by amending this legislation is that we're between 1st March and the 30th of April. Remember I said, sir, that businesses began to feel the pinch of the COVID pandemic and start to lay off people. By 1st March, early signs were beginning to manifest themselves. So those are the 2 dates that we've selected, 1st March and 30th April. If you've laid off people within that time frame, and sir, let me make it clear that there's no science to this. There's no science to this. So this is not feet and inches. This is not grams. Okay? We're working on the basis of reasoning, logic, and principle. So entities that have laid off individuals in that time frame, we know, sir, that they will be under pressure in week 13. In fact, sir, all like today will be week 13. And those businesses will be under pressure from their employees because the employees, as of right, will say, give me my severance. But, sir, we've only yesterday said to the country that we are returning you to the pre-COVID environment. And it takes time for those businesses to ramp up, start to get back customers again. Some of them, we anticipate, sir, will not get back customers again for perhaps a year and a half. Depending on which news channel you watch on mornings, they say that Main Street shopping in some places will not get back to what it was for another year and a half, in some cases 2 and 3. Mm-hmm. Tourism numbers will not get back up to where they were before. Certainly in another 6-8 months, they just can't. So by extending it to 22 weeks, sir, we're trying to give those businesses that have now reopened a 9-week breathing space. Now, sir, we can't guarantee anybody that in 9 weeks they will be up and running. We can't, sir. But a 9-week window in which we can allow you to start to build back up your portfolio of work, get your clientele established again, start to do some more business, sir. That 9-week window could well be the salvation of those businesses, whether you are a multi-million-dollar business or whether you are a small cook shop in Checker Hall. Now, sir, there is also a class of business that would have been perhaps hardest hit by COVID. And so we've also tried to provide mechanisms to help to protect that sector of the market. And I believe other speakers will go into that in greater detail. But the second major amendment that we are making is an amendment which says that if you laid off people before 1st of June, which is 2 months ago, in circumstances where your business was affected by a reduction in international travel, and that's measurable. Minister of Labor can tell you, with his vast experience in the hotel sector, that those are things that have been measured time and time again. So that's not any amorphous thing. So if you've shut down because of that, and as a result of the COVID directives that we've issued, then your employees that have been laid off will also get the benefit of it. We'll also have to wait 22 weeks. So again, another set of people. Now, you may well ask, as I'm sure the Leader of the Opposition will ask, but what happens if you don't fall within either of those categories, either lay off between 1st of March and 30th of April, or laid off prior to 1st of June as a result of diminution in travel and the COVID directives. In those instances, sir, and again, it's not science, but we have had an eye to what categories those businesses are. And we will allow those businesses, we will allow the employees who were laid off in those businesses to retain the 13-week right. So, sir, it would have been a wonderful thing if we could have said everybody can go to 22 weeks. It would have been. But, sir, I've said it several times, as we manage, we have to make sure that there's a minimum of friction and waste. And what that means is that we have to find, if you were a golfer, you would say the sweet spot. But if you're not a golfer, you would probably say we have to find the right mix. We have to find the right mixer that will help us to cater to as many businesses as possible. Yes, of course, there will be some that will not fit within this regime, but we've worked out, we've calculated that those businesses had earlier opportunities to open and therefore had a head start on other businesses. So we've done as best we could in the circumstances, with all of the data available from the Ministry of Finance, the data available from the economic records at the central bank, to try to work out what is that sweet spot, what is that right mix that allows us, sir, to help to protect businesses so they survive. But what about labor, sir? I'm satisfied. In fact, if I weren't involved in it, I would probably say I was impressed. Because at every step of the way, a tremendous level of consultation took place with labor. This consultation involved several meetings with the Barbados Workers' Union and helped with their suggestions and recommendations to craft the bill in the form in which it currently is. In fact, sir, their interventions improved it significantly beyond the early scheme that we had. And in return, Mr. Speaker, for asking employees to suffer the burden of an additional 9 weeks, we have determined that those employees who claim after 22 weeks severance pay will not have to go in the back of the line as far as applying to a severance payment tribunal. I've indicated to this chamber that right now you're looking at 5 and 6 and 7 years of delay. And what we're saying is, sir, an employee who has had to give up another 9 weeks, another 9 weeks of hope, another 9 weeks without the opportunity to claim his severance, we're saying that we're going to compensate you. We're making up for that by creating an expedited process so that you would not have to suffer the long delays that are attended with a claim before the severance payment tribunal. So as to be able to work that system out, we've provided in this bill that the minister will, by order, be able to determine what that process is. We've already begun to have discussions with labor to try to come up with a mechanism that will see all of those kinds of claims fast-tracked. So, sir, yes, they have to wait an additional 9 weeks, but what I'm saying is if they have to claim severance, we're making up to them that additional 9-week impediment by having an expedited arrangement. Mr. Speaker, individuals who are, and we've tried to make sure nobody falls between the cracks here. So even though by this sunset legislation we are denying the applicability of the current regime, we have provided in this bill that we're under the current regime, you have acquired rights, except for those two categories, that your rights will be preserved even though this legislation comes into place. So, sir, I could probably go on for a lot longer, but I don't think it's necessary. What we're trying to do is to throw a non-financial lifeline, sir. Very often, governments are called on to dole out money. Businesses are suffering, we want money. Businesses are suffering, we want tax incentives. Businesses are suffering, they want. We've not taken that approach in this context. What we've said is let us find a structure that will provide an economic lifeline to an enterprise while at the same time preserving the opportunity of work for an employee. And those two things, sir, are perhaps the two most important, because you can't have one without the other. If the businesses don't survive, there's no employment. And if you don't have a willing and able labor force, then the businesses can't employ anybody. Labor wanted a shorter period. The employers wanted an even longer period. We couldn't accommodate both. We sat at the table, sir, and the Leader of the Opposition should be happy to hear that the 22 weeks that we arrived at was agreed. Labor said, yes, we will accept 22 weeks We understand the importance of helping our businesses to survive, because without those businesses, they will not be able to employ labor. So we have not imposed anything on labor. Labor has agreed to 22 weeks, and we didn't have no one meeting. We had several meetings, and there are other things that are going to be put in place that the Minister of Tourism has been working on. Things that we couldn't put into this bill, but we're trying to make sure that when we do reopen, that our labor pool will be satisfied with the circumstances in which they will be asked to work. Mr. Speaker, this bill will have its sunset on the 31st of July. So after 31st of July, these provisions will fall away as if they never were. As if they never were, though any rights that you acquire under it, under Section 29 of the Interpretation Act, sir, those rights will continue. But this bill, this act, when passed, will cease to operate on the 31st of July, and we revert back to the 13 weeks. It is a matter of speculation what will happen after week 22. But we are satisfied, sir, that as a government we are putting measures in place to see the economy of Barbados begin to grow again, so that those businesses will have an opportunity, sir, once more to breathe the fresh air of economic activity and keep Barbadians employed. Mr. Speaker, this bill requires a constitutional majority. And let me explain before you say why it does. There are people, Mr. Speaker, who will have been laid off at the start of March. And by now, sir, their 13-week right will have accrued. But by extending that 13-week period to a 22-week period, sir, you will immediately capture the concept. We are taking away from an employee a right that has accrued. We are taking away from them a property right that has accrued and that has value and meaning and body today. And we are saying, wait 22 weeks. We're taking away a chosen action. We're taking away a property right. And we're saying, we're moving this right down by another 9 weeks. So that is a depriving of that individual of a property right, and therefore it requires that this bill be passed pursuant to the provisions of Section 49 of the Constitution. But I want to say, sir, I want to reiterate that while we are mindful that we are taking something from them, we recognize that that taking away really gives the business an opportunity to even preserve the employment, and in the event that it just cannot be preserved, we're compensating that individual by providing an expedited process for severance claims to be heard so that they can get their money sooner. Mr. Speaker, this last 3 months has not been easy. A generation of Barbadians has been forced to preside over something that perhaps we have not seen since World War II. I don't know of anybody in living memory who is able to testify to having endured the hardships that were present at the time of World War II. There must be some, of course. But we've tried to make sure, Mr. Speaker, that Barbadians throughout this pandemic have been able to have food. In some countries, they do not. We're trying to make sure that our labor force has been treated fairly and that their rights have been preserved. In some countries, sir, they have not. We've tried to preserve a healthcare system that continues to work for all Barbadians. In most countries, sir, they have not been able to achieve that. It hasn't been easy. But throughout this entire exercise, we've always seen it vital to bring all interested parties to the table and talk all parties through it, and as recent as yesterday, sir, engage them in the decision-making process. We went from a administration which was famous for having said you could like it or you could lump it. In those days, no regard was had for what the people wanted or what the people needed. We've had administrations, sir, that have outright fought with the business sector. Coincidentally, the same administration. We've learned from those lessons. We've learned from observing those lessons and how history has treated to those individuals and to those entities. And we are mindful and careful not to commit any of those errors. So we've consulted with everybody that had to be consulted on this bill. And we know, sir, that everybody will not be happy. There are some individuals that have already expressed a preference for us to have done one thing as opposed to this. Some would have preferred if we did that as opposed to the other. But we've tried to build a consensus where possible and try to hit upon that right mix that will allow our businesses to survive and continue to employ Barbadians while making sure that they benefit from giving up any rights that have crystallized, sir. I commend this bill. It is the product of many days and nights of hard work. I am satisfied, sir, that it takes us to where we need to be, and that to the extent that it has the impact of taking away rights from people, I am also satisfied, sir, that it is for the peace, order, and good government of this country, and that at the back end, they will see a benefit of an expedited process. I'm obliged to you. I'd like to move that this bill be read a second.
Honourable Representative James Angel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the matter which is before this House is one which is exceptionally critical for a number of reasons, and the importance of it can be seen through many perspectives. From the perspective of capital, the owners and operators of business, Mr. Speaker, sir, it assumes a critical importance because it effectively acts as a lifeline for businesses that have been shuttered and closed and continue in some cases to be closed and have been closed probably for the last 3 months. Many of these businesses, Mr. Speaker, sir, in Barbados have seen either very little revenue, and in several cases they have seen absolutely no revenue at all. It is also a fact, sir, that from the perspective of owners of these businesses, the reality of the COVID-19 experience as it hit Barbados, as it affected this island, has been one in which they would have seen steep declines in forward bookings from as early as during the month of January and during the month of February. So that even while people were still operating, they were seeing the beginnings of a negative trend in business. That applies obviously to the hotels. It applies, sir, obviously to the car rental companies. It applies to the travel agents. It applies right across, in fact, that which we call the tourism and hospitality sector in Barbados. And so therefore, sir, for properties, which might be a hotel, employing 100 or so people, in some cases more than that. For restaurants, for the car rental businesses, Mr. Speaker, sir, there is obviously a crisis operationally because, and I just give you but one example, there are some properties in Barbados where, by virtue of the fact that they have now been shuttered and closed for almost 13 weeks, and in some cases the 13 weeks is upon them, their severance commitment or severance liability, if triggered, would place them in circumstances where they would be called upon to pay in excess of $2 or $3 million. Now, obviously, for an enterprise that has not earned any revenue for 3 going towards 4 months, that creates an impossible situation and would put them in a situation, sir, where if they cannot meet the severance payment liability, then the state would have to step in. And the learned Attorney General is quite right, and it brings me to the second perspective from which this piece of legislation must be viewed as being urgent, and that is the perspective of the Crown. Because those of us, sir, who have to manage the affairs of Barbados have to recognize and take cognizance of the fact that the unemployment level in this country since the dawn of the COVID-19 environment, since we were compelled to issue the first directive, and that effectively shut down the country commercially, would have been an increase, sir, not of 30% unemployment or 40% unemployment, but north of that. And that the reality is, Mr. Speaker, sir, that mass claims on the Severance Payment Fund of Barbados, which would, in other circumstances, if we did not take this step, mass claims on the fund would threaten to overwhelm its ability. And Mr. Speaker, sir, a responsible government cannot sit idly by and recognize those circumstances and do nothing about it. It brings me then, Mr. Speaker, sir, to the third perspective, and perhaps the most important of all the perspectives, and that, sir, is the perspective of labor in this matter. Because for the workers in Barbados, the first issue here is job security and the uncertainty of the environment within which they now exist. As I speak to you, Mr. Speaker, sir, let us not forget that there are still several hundred businesses in this island that remain closed, where people are still at home, where there is no income in the family, where there is no certainty as to how they will feed their little children, sons and daughters, tonight or tomorrow morning, Mr. Speaker, sir. There's no certainty as to how the utility bills and the fixed obligations of a mortgage or the rent or the car loan or any of those other things, sir, can be paid. Mr. Speaker, sir, there is no certainty as to how or if they will access employment again, because in the event that we do not do that which we are now here about to attempt to do in your house, then, Mr. Speaker, sir, those businesses that previously were able to fuel the financing of the households that I'm talking about, and in my constituency, which, as you know, is part of the west coast of Barbados, and therefore intimately connected to the tourism and hospitality sector. In my constituency, we are talking about several households running into the plurality of over 1,000 of them. And Mr. Speaker, sir, the certainty, or rather the uncertainty of knowing what their fate is the issue for us tonight. Now, if the business closes, if the hotel closes, does not reopen, then where does employment come from next month or the month after that? And if it is allowed to have a ripple effect across the tourism and hospitality sector, which drives almost 50% of the gross domestic product of this country, and which has a knock-on and indirect effect on the Barbados economy, to the effect that if tourism flounders, agriculture flounders, to the effect that if tourism flounders, industry flounders, to the effect that if tourism flounders, Mr. Speaker, sir, virtually every other enterprise in Barbados feels the pain of that difficulty. The banking sector, the insurance sector, none, sir, none can say that they remain untouched. And therefore, if an effort is not made to intervene in order to restore some semblance of continuity and a capacity to give people a little breathing space, a little time, in order to save jobs and protect human life in this country, allow people to feed themselves, then, Mr. Speaker, sir, we would have failed the workers. Now, the Learned Attorney General has made it very clear, and he's absolutely right, that under ordinary circumstances, sir, each worker would have a right to trigger his or her severance after 13 weeks. And that right vests in every individual as a property right protected by the Constitution of Barbados, because we all have access or right to access our property. And what we are actively contemplating here today, Mr. Speaker, sir, is a deferral of that right for a period of time, 9 additional weeks, which gives, as I said, the business environment an opportunity to resuscitate itself. Now, I don't want to go into the legalese of the matter because I think that the Attorney General has done so more than adequately. But there's another aspect to this that we must speak to. And I feel I must speak to this House, sir, as a Minister of Tourism should speak to the House in the context of an industrial relations set of circumstances that give us an opportunity to take stock, as indeed we who participated in the vital meetings with the labor movement all had an opportunity to take stock of where we are. And as COVID laid bare, sir, some of the challenges facing the Barbados economy, and let's not pretend, COVID exposed the fact that we need to go a long way in terms of the use of our technology and to build out technological platforms and capacity to do things. Even, sir, some of the major fast food restaurants of this place found themselves wrong-footed because a simple process of delivering a piece of chicken was not able to be executed by virtue of the fact that you didn't have the technological platform to do it. We all know what we're talking about. Little children had now to be able to access technology, and we've had to make the necessary adjustments to get that platform up and going. Well, Mr. Speaker, sir, in the same way that COVID laid bare that reality, it also laid bare the reality that under the surface of this society, there has been for many years a failure to understand some fundamentals. And I want, in this short address to the House, sir, to begin by thanking the Barbados Workers' Union as the labor movement that sat at the table with government on this matter. Now, the right to trigger severance, sir, in the Severance Payments Act is viewed, in fact, the Act itself is viewed as a major piece of social engineering. It is viewed as sacrosanct. The Latin term sacro sanctus, made holy by right. And what, Mr. Speaker, sir, is the reason that it is treated as being sacred?